Okay, I propose we start again with the question session. Okay, Susan. Okay, so we have time for questions. We have approximately an hour. So Tecumseh has a question. Okay, so mention your name again because it's recorded.
Tecumseh, University of Vienna. I had a very quick question for you, Susan, about the about the nature of gesture and how we judge these different questions. And it really comes from my looking at the animal literature, attempting to say, for example, look at Kanzi and say, okay, does Kanzi have syntax, or is he SOV or whatever? So, and that, as I'm sure you're aware, is a bit of a messy literature, and there's a lot of assumptions that underlie that. So I want to come back to that first slide that you showed of the hearing child describing how to get from one place to another. Because it seemed to me, if I wanted to argue that she was doing it linguistically, that I could make some of the same arguments that you made for the home site. So for example, she conveyed moving on the same floor, so walking on the same floor with a flat hand, moving from one point of location to another, and then going down the stairs, she angled her hand, so she had a kind of gestural change and a motion change, and even some other little thing. And so naively, I would say, well, isn't that morphology just the same way all the other stuff?
But I think,
and so it's sloppy, but is
right. Well, we tried to do that with, I think this is great. You can hear me? So we tried to do that with the gestures that came along with speech. So we really did try to do it. And they produced far fewer than not this little. But we tried it, and we didn't find consistency. I mean, I take it if there's consistency within a person. I mean, you don't want to analyze one instance and go, oh, there it is, SOV. You need that pattern to be consistent over the person. We didn't find consistency within the person in the gestures that accompany the speech. So in any given instance, you could impose a morphology. We tried to impose a morphology on the moms too, because you can impose one, but the question is whether it fits to then explain the rest of the data. So we tried using the same tools for the deaf kids on the hearing kids' gestures, and it doesn't work as well.
Unless they don't talk. Once they talk, once they're forbidden from talking, then
yes. Once they're forbidden, although we still haven't had morphology, but we may not be looking right. We may not give them the opportunity to talk and all that sort of stuff. But and animals aren't talking. So
that's right. Well, Kanzi supposedly does say crib.
You already had a question before the break.
About the acquisition of knowledge and the learning tasks that you have been working with. We already discussed it, but not in public. So the issue is, what is the kind of reward that is involved in this learning process? And so, what is your view about that?
I have no idea. I mean, it's infants are motivated to learn, right? So this is spontaneous behavior. You put them in this situation. Of course, they are social creatures. They like other people. They like being addressed by others, so and so on. But I mean, the idea why they do this and why they modulate their attention on the basis of what's going on. The idea is this learning, but those that actually don't show much learning. So, but the question was what was the reward? Generally, what was the benefit? Selecting kinds, right? Well, because you don't. Because if you learn about a kind, you can then it's not just learn about the individuals, and we are. I mean, it can go on very long. So human cultures are full of kinds. So here we actually, most of these studies were done by artifacts. And these artifacts are grouped into kinds, which well, usually intermediated by the function, right? So that's the point. So if you learn how to use a certain kind of mobile phone, then you don't have to learn for another kind of mobile phone, because but you learned how to use generally this kind of object. And so therefore, learning about kinds makes sense in cultures, human cultures, where kinds But of course, it's not restricted to articles, but it was just an example.
Just continuing on your reasoning, does it mean that during this selection process, because we did not see the acquisition by the children or whatever, how long it take, does the children use this new knowledge or whatever to perform the task itself or not? It would mean that if it was yes, then there would be some subsequent kind of selection process, or if not, then it would mean that there is some kind of, I would say, rigorous programming for having a selection of items which give a progress in the acquisition of knowledge in the human species. The question is, does this experimental setting give the opportunity of the child to benefit from the knowledge it acquires?
No. The idea here is that it's not these experimental settings, it's these cognitive mechanisms and the assumptions that they use in these situations that will help them to learn generally in many kinds of situations when they are being communicated to. In this context, they don't learn anything. They learn something. This is completely rubbish. I mean, because objects are not together in the real life, so it's not. They don't learn anything. But the idea is that these mechanisms would help them to learn about the object kinds.
I'm not sure this is relevant, but let me just say, one thing that I've been surprised about these home centers is that they have not, as far as I can tell, invented names properly. So you might think that the very first thing you would do in life is invent a name for your mommy, your sister, to talk about, whatever. And they don't do that. So when they use things like this, it really feels like it's about category. They don't invent, this to be a sister or something. And that was surprising to me. They actually need some sort of cultural push to move in the direction of proper names. You don't seem to need a cultural push to do. Right, I think that is.
Okay, Charles had a question, right?
This question is for Susan. I was very interested in the demonstration that you showed that children were using not single units but combinations, and you made reference to the expected extent of combinations versus the tested ones. And I'm just wondering how you technically sort of did that type of calculation.
How we did it.
Right.
Basically, we just looked at the data. It didn't have these nominal constituents in it, and assessed how often they did 2 gesture sentences, 3 gesture sentences, 4 gesture sentences, 5 gesture sentences. Then we took the nominal constituent data and either counted it as a 3 gesture sentence if it had point, fly, pedal, or we counted that as a 2 gesture sentence. Point, fly, pedal. And to look to see how the data would fit. And it's better if you count it as quick fly, pedal, than if you count it as point. I'm not sure it's actually the right way to do it, because it sort of assumes that if you have something in here, it's not really counting for anything, but it must. I mean, if you have a relative clause that has 5 words in it, it's got to be more weighty than one that has 4 words in it, but it's the best way to do it.
The reason I asked this is because in my calculation, there's debate or discussion over whether the child is using, formulaic expressions or they're freely combining things. I'll be talking a bit about that later on, but that's actually, I think, a very important question.
Right.
And that seems to be arising here as well.
But so we were actually going to try to use the same kind of technique on hearing kids.
Right.
And it gets a little more complicated because of the assumption, because they don't just do 2-word things. And so we should talk about how to do that. But we're, yeah.
So I thought these were 2 wonderful talks, and actually I have a zillion questions for each of you.
Okay.
But just one that actually spans the 2. I'll try to direct it to you, Susan. Pierre's talk suggests that there's something special about the way we communicate with each other pedagogically, and you focus on the infant side, the way the infant is interpreting these communications with other people. But one might think that if Darwin Darwin cared about this ability that we had, they would also make the adults good pedagogical teachers. And in that context, I'm puzzled by your data on the parents talking to their deaf kids. I mean, you would think that the parents would know that the kids can't hear them, and therefore that the only information they're going to get are from these gestures. Plus, you know that, from your experiments, that if you tell the parents, shut up, they'll gesture in a much more effective and informative way. What do you think is going on with them? Why aren't they being better theory of mind reasoners and better pedagogues?
Honestly, I think it's our educational system. I mean, you remember, this is the old world of 35 years ago, where these parents were told, talk to.
Oh, okay.
So, in fact, we were thinking that in Nicaragua, where they're not so much sugar, that maybe we'll get moms who are going to, and they do gesture more without speech. So, in fact,
So they don't want kids to understand their gestures?
right. Oh, no gesture. It's got to be all speech. No gesture. In fact, we cover our lips when we talk to deaf children.
Okay,
It's
so
the
that's
sugar. Right, it's really crazy. But they're not crazy in Nicaragua. I mean, they're not crazy in America. They haven't stopped. Don't forget that. They're still crazy. But in Nicaragua, there isn't that from the oral tradition, and so we were thinking that maybe they'll get a different kind. They do get more gesture without speech, and so that could give them a leg up. And actually, I was thinking that they might go farther.
Yeah.
Even as child Alzheimer's.
So they are being good pedagogues by their own light.
Better.
Okay, so that turned out to be a boring question. Can I ask you one more? So this pertains to the studies on the adults who are told not to gesture. Actually, no, it pertains to the whole talk. What you show is that from the whole part of the talk on people who have a spoken language is that if you have a spoken language, your gestures look different unless you're told not to use it altogether or unless you don't have one altogether. My question gets back to issues that came up in the discussion yesterday, particularly in the context of those Australian languages and some others, that where you have a spoken language, but that spoken language doesn't make all the distinctions that are made by other spoken languages, like the difference between 6 and 7, or a verbal counting routine or something like that. And this question is actually for you, but also anyone else here who knows anything about these languages, since I know zero about them. What are gestures like in a language like that? And if you were to do your analysis on, say, an Australian who says, I've got a few kids, but makes 4 marks in the sand, or holds up 4 fingers, or something like that, would they look like the speechy language-like gestures of your adults who are prevented from talking, or the home signers, or will they look like the gestures that accompany speech?
So my guess is that they look like the gestures that accompany speech, but they still could be free to convey other information. Just because they accompany speech doesn't mean that it's slavishly doing everything that speech does.
But I'm wondering, would it show word order effects and combinatorial effects of the sort that you get with fewer words in spoken languages that have them?
We would have to look at that. So there's issues of form, and then there's issues of content. So my hunch is that in form, it would still look like regular old stuff, but I think in content, it would be really interesting. I've often wondered, people look at these positionals that in other languages that are very, very rich, and they argue we don't have any of that stuff, as we don't in English, but nobody's ever looked at the gestures that accompany that. So some of the things that we say are in other languages and not in our language, this gesture could take up the slack, but I still think it would be smushy. So I don't know, that's it.
G.
A fairly theoretical question for Pierre. Do you think that one's experience of the world sorts things out into things which need to be known as particulars, some, and others where the particulars are not important? So I'm imagining a situation where a mother points to a particular thing and indicates that it's dangerous. Now, if she points to the child's uncle, the child may well, steer clear of the uncle, but not other members of that kind, other people. Whereas if she points to a snake, the child not being able to distinguish one snake from another may avoid all snakes So it's not only a difference in the things that are pointed to, but a difference in the message that's given. So if she points to the corpse of the uncle and says dead, then the child will interpret that, that particular is dead. But also if she points to a dead snake and says, dead, the child will not interpret that all snakes are dead, but just that this particular one is dead. So that, there's a four-way combination, and you only get the generic interpretation in the one case where you point to the dangerous thing, which is rather unfamiliar.
First answer.
Well, yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. So actually, we use these gestures. There are studies showing that we use these gestures. Parents use these gestures more likely in referring to particulars than to kinds. So, which is interesting because it suggests that if infants and children have this kind of bias, it's not coming from the input because statistically it should refer to particulars. But the point here is that if they have this bias, default bias, to interpret them as referring to the kind, then they have to learn when to remove this. And it's actually very difficult, so I just talked to Susan about it. So non-verbally very difficult to disambiguate that I'm pointing to this particular object and not this kind if you have this. Right? The language helps here very well, of course, because it's full of determinants and other kind of things. And probably are also right, so other contextual cues, what's going on here, so in a game when I need some object and I point to a certain object, and probably the context clarifies exactly in what sense I'm referring to the object. And of course, if you know the predicate, right, so like being dead, it's very unlikely to be extended to be kind, then it helps as well. So the point is not that that should be pervasive and should always be interpreted, but in the absence of other kinds of evidence, and especially with novel objects, right? That's the default bias. That's the point.
I had one question about word order and one about generics. On the word order question, you consistently use terms like actor and patient, and consistently did not use terms like topic and focus. But in spoken language, we know that both kinds of notions are relevant. So there's a question about whether we're really looking at order determined by thematic notions as opposed to order determined by discourse function.
We tried to do topic comment. Topic comment is not so trivial to do if you don't really have a discourse. The moms are sitting there going, talking, and so on. It's not really a conversation going on. To the extent that we've tried to identify what the topic is and what the comment is, that doesn't explain the order as well as activation. So that's why we've ended up using the terms. But of course, I don't know if I'm good at it. I don't know if I've done the topic comment just right. But to the extent that we've tried, it has to work as well. That's what the evidence is semantic terms.
Well, in articulated spoken language, you play around with these things using definiteness and indefiniteness, which would be
It's a little hard to do. I mean, these nominal constituents are the first thing, so that's this cup, that bird. So we might be able to play with that now that we sort of put our infrequent or a little lady and all that. But I mean, if you have any suggestions as to how to get a topic comment other than see your pants, which is how we do it, it's hard. And it hasn't explained things. We don't get a print all of that. That's what it means. But it feels like the most natural thing to use. Topic comment, but it's.
Well, I didn't mean to suggest that. I just meant that it may play a role.
It might, right. And we've tried to. I think, we've actually tried to do some topic because Marie has this intuition, at least in the adults, there's object fronting and it's topic. Sort of topic fronting kind of thing. But maybe it's a successful way to do it. Yet. The adults at their
I think in some respects it may clean up some of the. So right now the patient act ordering is a tendency, it's fairly robust across several children, as you saw, but the noise might be better explained by exactly what you bring up.
Thanks. Oh, sorry.
Oh, the generic question.
Yeah,
A quick comment.
A quick comment on generics, which may not be of any great importance to what you were trying to get at, but the notion of generic is a complex notion that we can see in various ways that there's no single notion of generic. If we look at the Western European languages, and we look at the way that definite articles either are or are not used with generics, we find that there's no single notion of generic. And maybe that's related to the question of how you characterize the notion of generic. You said they're tolerant of counterexamples, which is often the case, but if you shift over to mathematics, then you get all sorts of generic-looking statements that seem to be intolerant of counterexamples. And you say they express essential properties, which feels plausible, but then I couldn't help thinking of sentences like kittens are cute. And I don't know what an essential property is. That's not.
Yeah, I mean, those points were not definitions of genetics. I mean, there's no good definition. So there's a properties that were described, not by me, by others in the literature. And I actually said that anyway, I was just talking about one kind of genetics, kind-referring genetics. Of course, there are other kinds of genetics as well. So that's one of them. And the second is that as I said, generic expressions tend to refer to fundamental properties, essential properties. It's not necessary. But again, the examples for that, if you don't know whether it's what kind of property it is, then at least children would think that that's actually important, kind defining property, which is expressed by genetics.
Okay, quick to Liz. Your question was a good one. Hearing parents of deaf children in the day and age of David were told, don't sign to your kids or they'll never learn to talk. Not signing themselves, they didn't know the difference between signing and gesture, so many of those parents withheld gesture. And we know that withholding gesture can be detrimental for hearing children. So there's a lot of consequences in that domain that are worth looking at. Really making it twist your head around trying to figure out why they do it. I have a comment, a yes/no question, then my real question. The comment is the woman in the testing situation, Heidi Feldman, her dissertation might be of interest to you. Because one of the findings that she had was that deaf children only point to things that they already have signs for. And that may fit in with your kinds type stuff, and it's an observational study, but it might be worth you to look at.
Never published my
But she'll
Yeah.
Heidi, I never thought of it until I was watching the tapes, but you transcribed the parents, you transcribed the kids. Did you transcribe Heidi?
So we tried really hard not to influence the kids. In that particular instance, we met with our committee, and our committee said, you gotta get a comprehension test. You gotta get a comprehension test. So we spent session 9 trying to feedback the gestures that we used. So that was unusual. We really tried hard to sit on our hands.
Because she also had things like questions.
I know, she did. The questions we do keep for sure, isn't there? But in that instance, we really were trying, it was just that one session. We do. But that was a function of our dissertation. So we said, you got it. And when you look at Heidi, she does this, she's not doing exactly like David. And so then we decided this is not going to be good.
So my real question is, and I always, I'm very conservative on whether I'll call things language or nominal constituents or anything like that. So in your argument for nominal constituents, you gave various tests, but you said these kids are more or less at the 2-word stage. Right? So one of the conditions that I don't think I heard you mention was that point fly is a unit. And pedal is its own. If they're at a 1-word, 2-word stage,
Right, how do I know that?
Right, why not there? Over there is a bird or whatever.
Right. I think that's it's very
It's peddling.
Yeah, I mean, they have to have evidence that, I mean, there's two kinds of evidence. One is that there is some rhetoric evidence that this thing, so we only would count it as part of the sentence if they drop and pause at the end. We also have production probability evidence that's a little complicated that sort of suggests there is something like sentence node. So if it's two things in one thing, it's just chunking. But in order to argue that it's a hierarchy, there has to be this node, whatever that node is, sentence or better. So there's some evidence from production probability that you have to take both pieces into account in order to predict the production probability. It's a little complicated, but it's basically when there's a shared element in two clauses, in order to predict a pattern a pretty pattern, you have to take both clauses into account. It can't just be sequence. In order to do it, you need to know that this one's shared over here. So it sort of means you have to take this higher node into account. That's the best I can do.
But contact gestures aren't pretty.
Say again?
Contact gestures aren't pretty. People who are gesturing in this contact type stuff don't give you pretty outputs. So I'm not sure that.
Well, none of this is pretty. This is all of it. But it's within David. I mean, this is all. But it's within David, so it's consistent within this one child. I'm arguing from this one child's data that he actually does have something called, that you might call a sentence node, or a node, I don't know what you call it, but a node that encompasses that. But I think it's a really good question.
Can I just come back to that? So in the American Sign Language, one of the first cohorts showed a video of a man pushing a woman over, which sign, according to you guys, man push,
Woman fall.
woman fall, that's right. So you decided at some point that that was two sentences, two packages, something like that. And then later on you decided that it became just one whole episode. So you have criteria for making that kind of decision, which seem parallel to what Susan's doing.
I think one of the things that we were looking at was the inability to get man push woman without another action following, which is a different kind of criterion.
Right.
It's like we were trying to say, we're going to be very conservative. You're not packaging this into one unless we've got evidence for it. And we single verb valence was what we were seeing.
Right, and we've used Montaught methods. Just use sort of dropping in the hand, pausing, things like that. Anything, we just look at that, and then anything that's in all that stuff, we try to analyze as a chunk. But of course, there's pausing within that too. And that Maria's the point.
This is sort of a follow-up on Richie's question about the topic comment structure. In spoken languages, then when you look at topic comment structures, you also look at prosody, right? I know that in sign language there's also phonology of the signs.
Right.
So maybe you can look at sort of phonology of the home signers to see whether there's any possibility of looking at the prosody of the signing that you can actually help you determine whether there's a topic.
Yeah, so we've tried to do that a little bit. We've just written, Lauren Applebaum has written a paper with Maria, trying to look at the prosody and look at markers that are traditionally used in sign languages to see. They do come at the end of the sentence, and now we're looking to see whether it does anything more interesting for us. There's a little bit of evidence that we can see some process. It's really and there's a lot on the face of it. I mean, you saw these videotapes. We're not analyzing the face anymore. But it's a very good idea.
Speaking over my position. They were raising their hands all the time, so you organized this.
So this is for Susan, this question. I just wanted to ask regarding the iconicity of the gestures. There is this interesting discussion in sign language literature that iconicity is something that second language learners of sign use a lot, whereas deaf children acquiring sign language as the first language, they don't rely on that. There is no advantageous sort of status. And this is true for Christopher as well, although he's an adult. Okay, but he is autistic and he didn't actually use iconicity to help learn, sign lexicon. So I was wondering whether one good way of looking at this as language and what your home signers are doing is to see whether they actually had gestures that were not iconic, right? Because that would show that it's not just the process of, you know, making things phonologically perhaps more language-like, but there actually was a difference in the status of the signs or of the gestures.
So I agree, it would be great, except that this is a very unusual circumstance. They have to be, if they're not iconic, if they get too weird, nobody's going to understand. And it is, I don't actually think that community in the situation is shaping the structures that we find, but I think it's essential that this be communicated. I don't think they're just going to sit there and gesture to themselves without somebody on purpose. So the closest we get to non-iconic, which is why I sort of presented it as the little, you know, the fact that one kid will break a category here and another kid will break it there. But it's comedy. Because if they start using, you know, this to mean a ball, who's going to get it? So you know, and it is community. It isn't just for themselves. It really isn't. But it's a, you know, so the kid points at the bottle or a cup and does this and points at the cup. It doesn't matter. Everybody will understand it more. So he adds more structure than he needs to for the community situation. And I think it really, stuff has to continue. So I think that's why it doesn't pull away from iconicity, although it would have been nice. We had two of them. I mean, that's Nicaragua. You know, that's we sort of get it there. But I don't think you'll find it in this situation, but not for, you know, profound reasons, just for reasons.
Hi, Daniel Harbour, also a question for you. I was very curious about the strange word order that you got from your students when they began having to speak in gesture. And I did wonder what you could put that down to. So one thing is that, so it might just be genuinely emergence of weird word order, but on the other hand, you might think, well, you start off with an ashtray in contact with a donut, and so contact is important. So if you ask them instead to say the donut moved into the ashtray, then if contact is important, they'd say ashtray maybe at the end. But if the non-moving part is important, then they'd still say it at the beginning. And sort of just in a related vein, if I sort of think about this in verb final languages, then I know, well, at least in one, I have the option of saying precisely ashtray in donut.
Yeah.
And then do the moving verb. I could also do donut in ashtray.
Okay, so we can muck around with that. We have mucked around with that. So the way those transparencies are set up in a particular way, where a little girl, you know, jumps, say, into the ashtray. And if you put the transparencies together, if we make it so that the girl is on the outside, then you have the arrow, and then you have the ashtray. Let's use that. So girl jumps into the ashtray. That's a scene which is before the event happens. When we put it together, it's sort of before it happens. But I could draw the little girl on a transparency in a different way. I could draw her here. And then it would be after this. It turns out that makes a difference in the word order. So you get that order that I gave you when it's before, but when it's after, you get the stage where the ground is first, then comes the action, and then comes the moving object. So you could, which is a little like aspect, it's sort of whether the act is completed or not, affects it. So I agree. I mean, I completely agree, and I think it's actually sort of an interesting way to play around with it. That's only for the moving events, because if they're acting on things, then the transparency moves the same. You know, whether it's swung the pail before or after, it actually moves the same. But for the moving events, you can play around with the order. And it sort of suggests something interesting. There is a difference in the way they order these things. I think it's a function of whether they think about it as a completed act or as an act that's just its beginning.
The one means the girl has jumped into the ashtray.
Right, that's right. But right, and this may bring us to Lisa's question: how much they're sort of thinking about this in language terms. You know, because we haven't ruled out that they're not. We know that they're not literally translating it because they're not using the word order. We don't know that they aren't bringing language resources to bear. So.
Everyone chat.
Just a quick related question. I'm Sita Zahar from Leiden University, and I was wondering if it has to do with the difference with so this question between language and non-language use of signs. Do like real sign languages use the same order of subject, object,
Or sign language, I mean, ASL, I think these guys would have been doing, ASL is considered to be SVO. But with the ashtray thing, assuming they set up the ground, sign languages tend to set up the ground and then do the moving object and then the action. But sign languages vary with respect to the author.
So if they start to learn a sign language, then it would be similar to what you find here.
Well, it might be, and also this ADSL funding, that they're finding that SOE is the first form. They haven't done the ground stuff as far as I know. And I don't know. Have you guys looked at that order in the Robert sign language yet?
Not beyond the, no.
Not yet. So there's places to look for that.
Okay. Question about learning to read and write in these deaf children. Since in the case of the normal child, it was the establishment of a relationship between auditory and visual system, which is being mobilized for the learning of reading and writing. Here it should be not anymore the auditory system, but the motor system, because the whole system, the whole iconicity or whatever you call it, is associated with motor gesture and recognition. So first of all, you have in a special techniques for learning to read and write in these children. Second is the reimaging showing that the circuits involved in reading and writing are different from those of normal children. And last, is there any evidence for neurological deficits which are not located like in the daydream traditional Alexia and agraphia kind of?
Okay, so now, are we talking about home signers? Are we talking about deaf kids acquiring sign language from deaf parents?
Yes.
Which one?
Whatever.
They're really different. They're really, really different. And these guys can speak more than the deaf kids. Yeah, and it's a very important question. I mean, first of all, deaf kids have trouble learning to read. And many of them don't make it past 3rd and 4th grade. And people have to start looking for ones who are successful. It's a very interesting question. How they're successful, whether they're being successful on the back of a phonological system or a non-phonological system. So that's really an interesting question that these two may get to speak more to. There is some evidence from Rachel Mayberry that these deaf kids of hearing parents who are making up a system do have phonological systems. And when you look at their fMRI patterns or whatever, they look different.
But importantly,
An important difference in the deaf individuals that Susan is talking about that are being studied by Rachel Mayberry is that they did not develop a communication system with their families. Yes, I mean, I've talked to her enough about it that I feel persuaded that they did not have an existing system that they used to communicate with the people around them. Because for the reason, it's a very simple reason, they had extremely chaotic upbringings. So they were living in one place and then in another place, and several of them are immigrants. And so I think it's plausible that they did not, although it's not consistent with my own experience of working with deaf people who grow up in hearing families, but all the people I have worked with have stable families who try to engage them with the gestures. So I wouldn't necessarily expect the same kinds of neurological differences necessarily. I mean, it's an open question, but I think that's a really important distinction.
It's a really interesting question, because you have these deaf kids from Rachel where they're really are not getting, they're not only not getting any input, but they're not really given the opportunity to develop their own. Then you have the kids who study Pica, study who are in much better shape in the sense that they've developed their own. I don't think we know anything about their neurological future. And then you have deaf kids of deaf parents, or even hearing parents who are getting real input. And they're going to look different still. It's really, we know too little thus far, but we'll know more.
Nora, you had a question.
I do. And it's actually not. Yeah. So you opened your talk by talking about situations in which babies care about a location being filled, and they don't really care what's filling it. And in other situations, they really care about the particular object, and they don't really care what it is. And then you, of course, concentrated on that second situation and argued that they're learning, about generics. And I wanted to do two things. One is to, draw attention to the fact that I think it's interesting that there's a limitation, so that it's possible to think, if you're a baby, about locations. It's possible to think about specific objects. It's difficult, apparently, to link specific objects to specific locations, which later it won't be. I mean, you need to remember your particular keys, which are, after all, not generic, or in some particular location, they can only be in one. And so, just to note that, and if you have any thoughts about it, I'd be curious. But my real question is, since they can only care about one thing at a time, and since, as you highlighted, there are particular situations in which the adult that they're interacting with may be trying to really concentrate on a particular location, or may be trying to communicate generic information, and you sort of alluded to how they sort between the two in terms of some theory of mind about what the interlocutor is trying to communicate. But what are the cues there? What is it that is alerting them in specific? And has that been studied? Have you studied it? What do you think about that?
Well, the difference is communication, but there's no communication. So that's
very generic, though.
Yes. So what you're interested in?
Well, in other words, does it matter if there's eye contact? Does it matter if you shake the object? Does it matter what the dynamics are?
What the dynamics are of the system, so that there's rhythmic movement, there's location. I mean, I can think of many sort of micro cues which might, in isolation or cumulatively, define the situation.
Well, we try to make the two situations as similar as possible, except, of course, the crucial differences. But of course, I mean, the whole idea is based on which I didn't talk about it. First, in order to do this, first infants have to recognize that are being communicated, right? So they need these ostensive signals like eye contact, calling by their name, infant-directed speech, which defines the situation as communication and defines them as being addressed, right? So that's the first step. Second, they have to expect that there will be referential signals, right? And again, we have studies showing that they have these expectations about referential signals, especially in ostensive context. They expect that the person should be connected to some object around, right? So that is the second one. And so again, they have to learn how these signals work, right? So they have to learn about gaze, that it could be referential signal, pointing, and we know that they have to learn that because especially pointing, this is culture specific. So many, practically all cultures use pointing gestures, but different ways. So it's not always the hand, not always the index finger, and so on, and not to mention other kinds of referential signals and words which are culture specific. So these are preconditions. But so I started at this point. So when infants recognize that they are being communicated and they expect referential signals and they even recognize the referential signal to others with a certain object, then how they modulate their attention on the basis of that, right? So of course shaking an object, right? But of course it depends on the context. So we didn't try shaking an object in the context when the infants being not communicated. But shaking actually, it's a referential signal. We use that many times, and that's actually most effective in very young babies, 3-4 months old. If you shake something in front of them while being addressed, by speech or something, then they actually tend to follow that object and even stay in the object. If you put it down and you move it away, they stay in the object. So I don't know whether I answered the question. But there are lots of subtle cues here. You are absolutely right. But what we try to do is not concentrate specifically the cues, but how these cues are interpreted, how they can group together in terms of the ostensive signals, which defines that this is communication, referential signals, and so on.
or, yeah.
Here. I was wondering whether we could link what you say about generic to the fact that we know that children do not combine different type of information. So, for example, with respect to core knowledge, and if I refer to Liz's work, they don't combine, for example, spatial information with color. I never thought about it, but Munduruku don't do that. They don't combine spatial information with color. When we try to do false belief test with Munduruku, they did not pass. And I never understood why, and I don't think anybody understood why. So we have the coin, we display the coin, we say, where is the coin? They say, it does not matter. It does not matter.
That's not failure.
And,
They're right, it doesn't.
well, it does not matter exactly, it matters for us. And we ask them, where is the guy that was away going to look for the coin? And they say, well, he's going to look for the coin wherever it is. And I was wondering, would it be linked to the question of Noah? And would it be linked to the fact that they interpret this as a kind of generic coin? So wherever it is, they are looking for the coin. And one way to interpret the way that your way of looking at generic would be to say that in fact they just look at the object without paying any attention to, they just look for the coin. And then you interpret it as generic, but it would be a kind of non-combination of it. So it's not a specific coin, because to have a specific coin, you would have to combine different type of information.
It could be, but I don't think that that's the case. So that you can easily test that with a non-verbal positive task, because if that's the case, then this kind of combination to particular features, right, and locations would be the only possible. But I find it very unlikely. But there are non-verbal false belief tests where when this communication, it's the fact that where the object is and what's happening is not communicating, then it should go away and they should pass this if there's no problem. On the other hand, you are actually right that it could actually generate problems in terms of misinterpreting information or not encoding information when it's necessary. So, but the task which I skipped that we talked about it is a searching task that we influence. It's a famous effect described by Piaget, the not Pierre, also we hide an object at certain location several times, and then they try to find the same location, even if you actually hide the object in front of another location. And our interpretation was that it could be coming from exactly this bias, so because they don't understand the context which we define that this is about this particular object in this particular location. That's the game that you have to pay attention to define it. But perhaps they misinterpret it as a kind of teaching situation which would tell them where this object is usually found. And then, so that's our interpretation. And what we found that exactly was consistent with this, because if you remove all the communication cues from the situations, then they don't perseverate anymore, so they don't go back to the original location. So that would be a case where this bias is actually makes them perform worse because they misinterpret the situation.
Okay, there's room for one final question. To go, say you still have your question.
Another one for Pierre. And I want to in my never-ending search for an experiment that would convince you that animals might have natural pedagogy and ostensive communication, I want to suggest an experiment. Tell me if this would actually convince you. So you got, and this is in the context of birds, that the mother will peck at food and sometimes make little vocalizations called food calls. She doesn't eat the food, the chicks come out with the food. I think that may be it. So here's the experiment. Chicks discover food that has different colors and different textures and different locations, and crucially some essential thing like a taste or a lot of fat, something like that. That's a control condition. And then two mother bird conditions. One where the mother is just eating the food, not making any vocalizations, none of the ostensive cues, and the birds, the babies go to learn that. And then the final one would be the clincher, where the mother pecks at the food, makes these food calls. We could even play the food calls in so the mother doesn't know what's going on. And now the prediction, if I understand correctly, the generic prediction would be that the babies should focus on only those cues that are in some sense essential, so the taste or the fat cues. And they should ignore things like location cues and the coloration set. So if we got that result, would that convince you?
Yeah. Okay. I haven't published all, but it's the same example I mean, it's almost happening actually. So there are studies on that. So with hen and chicken, but there are important aspects because it's not that convincing. We don't know whether the hen just does it in the essence of chicken and so on. So but if it is properly done, it would show that it happens in other species, and it would just show that it's it's an adaptation that could emerge in different lineages. I wouldn't mind that at all. Empirically, I don't think that's the case. So there's no good study that would show that's the case, but it's not impossible.
Good.
Okay, I'd like to thank Susan and Gary for